Do you have the knowledge to work with the next generation of refrigerants? ESCO Institute can help you learn the information you need with the low GWP A2L refrigerant safety course. Did you know newer refrigerants are less harmful to the environment? Did you know there are new standards for the transportation of low GWP refrigerants? Did you know most A2L equipment will require refrigerant detection systems, and you will be required to use no spark, no arc tools and equipment? Get the facts! These are just some of the things you need to know to work on new equipment. Take the online course to learn more. The ESCO Institute Low GWP A2L Refrigerant Safety course is interactive and engaging and will prepare you for the Low GWP A2L Refrigerant Safety Certification exam. You will find the Low GWP A2L Refrigerant Safety course on the HVACR Learning Network, the industry's leading source of online and digital content. Visit hvacr.elearn.network today.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us once again on Did You Know, the ESCO HVAC show. So Ty and I have the wonderful opportunity to go out and explore some more technical training facilities to be able to see what's happening in the industry, to see what is changing, to learn about the things that we're moving to, and to also learn about where we came from. So we're hanging out at the Lennox Technical Training Facility in Richardson, Texas, and we're joined today by Bob O'Brien. Bob, how are you, sir?
Very good. How are you guys?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Ty?
Doing fantastic.
It is. We're winding down. This has been such a fun day. We started out nice and early, and we're still going. We're having a good time. And we wanted to spend some time talking about some of the history of our industry, especially when it relates to the fuel side. So Bob is the Director of Training for NORA, the National Oil Heat Research Alliance, and Bob spends his career focusing on the direction that the oil industry is going. And I myself, when we first started having this conversation, didn't realize how much the oil industry is changing, and it's very, very enlightening and interesting. And so well, thank you for joining us today, Bob, and let's spend a little time talking about the history of fuels. Like, where did it all begin? And later we'll talk about actually where we're going.
Sure, thanks. Glad to be here. With delivered fuels, basically started with coal, right? Turn of the century or so. My great-grandfather built a house in Brooklyn in 1899 with a coal boiler in 1899.
Oh, wow.
The previous century. And my great-aunt inherited it. When she passed in 1980, it was still fired with coal. She refused to convert it.
The same machine?
Same boiler.
Yeah.
I remember helping my grandfather stoke it. It was my grandfather's sister. So it's been around for quite a while. So initially it started with coal, and to fill that demand, companies arose to deliver coal, initially horse and later by truck, well into the 20s. Starting after World War I, there was a transition to heating oil, fuel oil, to convert these. Natural gas really hadn't gotten at all to the East Coast. It was
right.
Not widespread, not a lot of distribution, not a lot of availability. So the Northeast basically became a coal initially, and then oil stronghold as people converted to automatic heating. Coal is very labor intensive.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of shoveling, a lot of tons. Fuel oil is a lot more energy dense than coal is per pound, easier to handle, safer, cleaner. So it was a big thing with, coal was a dirty fuel. A lot of work. The women were home primarily during the day, and it fell on them to shovel it and shovel out the ash. It was a lot of, you were hands-on. It wasn't automatic heating where you turned up a thermostat and you were comfortable.
Yeah.
And that's what we sold as a comfort, comfort, cleanliness.
Yeah, a lot of manual labor to that. So in the Midwest, in Indiana, where I'm from, we used to work on a lot of turn-of-the-century homes that still had coal chutes. Now, many of those, I would say most of those, had already been converted over to natural gas, but some of those were actually fuel oil. So even myself, I had one particular unit at a farm here in Indiana that was originally a coal unit that was converted over to a fuel oil burner. So it was interesting because you're working in this space that is very, very dry and dusty from all of the existing coal, and yet now we're introducing an oil tank and oil fuel, and it was quite the interesting contraption. So as a young technician, got kind of introduced to the nasty world of coal and the oil world, and it was very intriguing for me. And so I never really thought about how many fuel oil systems are still in operation. Let's kind of talk a little bit about that use of fuel oil, because I don't think a lot of people don't realize how extensive fuel oil is in our industry and how many units are still in service.
About 5 million.
It's a lot.
There's actually quite a bit still in Indiana.
Yeah.
And it's a common path to take where people went from coal to fuel oil and to natural gas later on. Not as popular in the Northeast. It's still 85% of that 5 million is focused in the 6 New England states, plus New York, Jersey, Pennsylvania.
Well, they say that
States have the vast majority, but there's still a lot. NORA's active in Indiana, in Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan. There's still quite a bit out there. On a percentage basis, small, but 5 million is
That's still a lot of units.
Yeah, it's a lot of units out there.
Yeah.
It's also slightly less than 5% of the homes in the country.
they say with the conversion from coal to the fuel oil burner, it's like a well-oiled machine.
Oh, look at that.
Major step up, advertising, cleanliness, the movie Christmas Story, where the father would always be in the basement in Indiana playing with the furnace, clinkers, and that was the coal furnace.
Well, Todd Clure was just saying that his in-laws still use fuel oil. So, Todd, I'm curious where they're actually still using fuel. Just kind of discuss where it is in the world. So when we look at that progression, we started out with actual coal, right? In Germany. All right,
Wow.
Thanks, Todd.
I was not expecting that.
No, I wasn't either. So, another part of the world still using fuel oil. So when we're talking about our early natural draft coal-fired furnaces, right, that we would eventually start converting over to fuel oil, tell us a little bit about fuel oil and where it came from or where it still comes from, Bob.
Well, actually, we're moving to renewable fuels to replace fuel oil, but historically, it's a process of distillate, basically the same as diesel fuel. So when they refine a barrel of crude oil, you're going to get your gasoline segment, and then after that, you would get distillates. Kerosene initially lighter, and then the heavier oils, heating oil, diesel fuel, and on up to heavy oils that used to be used commonly in ships. Large buildings. New York City still has buildings that are burning number 4 oil, which is, and if it's 30 degrees, you could use a shovel on it. It's quite thick.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oil, and there's still number 4 oil buildings in New York City at the moment, or the whole Northeast. There's still quite a few.
Yeah, so Paul just made a comment that he still uses number 2 fuel oil. So for those that are joining us that do not understand the difference in those fuel oils, can you explain to us a little bit about that evolution of fuel oils and why we had different numbers for those?
It's different grades, and basically it's equivalent to viscosity and weight. So number 1, kerosene is very light. I don't know if you've ever seen kerosene. It's almost water-like, very thin.
Very thin.
Number 2 is a little darker, a little bit heavier. Not much, but a little bit. And then number 4, there is no number 3 to the best of my knowledge. There is a 5, 6, and number 4 is even thicker, darker, and then all the way up to 6. 6 at ambient temperature is basically like asphalt driveway sealer, that kind of consistency.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, the tanks heated. Typically, they have steam coils off the boiler. These are generally steam. That's the other thing too, where oil and hydronics are very closely related. They developed in the same areas at the same time. So you'll see a lot more oil boilers still in the field than warm air furnaces. Hydronics and heating oil are much closely entwined. Both developed in the Northeast in the same time frame. So even though oil has a small market share overall, in the hydronics market, they probably have a third or so.
Wow, that is pretty significant.
5% of the overall thing. So most oil guys are also hydronics guys by design, both steam and hot water. So the commercial use number 6 oil would have a steam boiler. They'd have a coil in the tank that would heat it with steam, over 100 F, to get it to flow and burn properly.
Okay. Yeah, so Murph actually just commented that there's still a lot of fuel oil systems in the Jersey Shore area, but they are diminishing. In the same way here in the Midwest, we are starting to look at replacements for that. So when we look at, we hear a lot about decarbonization in the industry. And so we spend a lot of time talking about, what we're doing, the efforts we're doing for decarbonizing. So let's talk about fuel oil. So traditionally, like we went from coal into fuel oil, so a distillation of crude, and now that we're starting to suck our crude reservoirs dry with these giant siphon straws that we're using in today's economy, we're looking for alternatives beyond our traditional fuel oils. So where do we go from here?
Biofuels. That's basically most of our educational and all the research and most of the educational efforts are put towards transitioning the heating oil industry to renewable fuels. There's no future for a high carbon industry, whether it's natural gas, heating oil, propane, fossil fuels in general have a limited lifespan. I don't know what that lifespan is going to be, but there's not a long-term future for any of them. They're all high carbon fuels. So the goal is to transition the heating oil industry to a low carbon future.
Where does that biofuel come from?
There's two main ones. There's one primary one right now that's in common use, is biodiesel. A lot of states have mandates. New York's going to a B10 mandate. So when you say B10, they mean 10% biodiesel, 90% petroleum. Rhode Island is currently B10. All the heating oil sold in the state of Rhode Island is 10% biodiesel. New York's currently 5. We're going to 10 in 2025, July 125. Going to be 20 in 2030. Connecticut's more aggressive. They're slower in the beginning, but they're going to be 50 by 2035. So a lot of the Northeast states have pretty rigorous mandates. So it's not whether you want to or not. It's going to be mandatory.
Okay, so we're phasing out our traditional fuel oil, now moving into blended fuels, and then eventually I'm sure we're going to get into completely, natural,
biofuels. Renewable. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's a pathway to fully renewable fuels, but the source of them is plant oils and animal fats, primarily soybean, canola, things like that, and they're processed. Biodiesel is a pretty easy process. Renewable diesel, another fuel, a little more complex, but it's more similar to diesel fuel. That's a refinery. Renewable diesel is made with a refinery. Instead of putting crude oil into it, you're basically putting these feedstocks. Canola oil, animal fats, chicken fats, that type of thing. And through the refining process, sustainable aviation fuel also comes through that process. Renewable propane as well is also a byproduct of that process. So all those renewable fuels come from that same source.
Very interesting. So I know when we were converting our coal oil furnaces over to a fuel oil furnace, right? So we're now introducing a pressurized burner assembly with a high energy ignition source into that combustion chamber. What is the difference when we move from a fuel oil into some of the replacement fuels?
Not as much as converting a coal boiler furnace to heating oil in the first place. People used to have to remove the grates and physically build chambers. Large boilers, people would actually go in there and get inside the boiler and do it from the inside out. Kind of like fire brick. It's a filthy.
It's a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. This is basically close to turnkey. At lower blends, you don't have to make any changes. So the states that have mandated B10, B20, there's no mechanical changes at all needed. The biodiesel is slightly more viscous, slightly, not a lot. A little bit less energy content per gallon. BTUs per gallon is slightly less. Again, not a lot. At B20, it's less than 2%. And that's basically it. And there's oxygen content in the bio, but we've done extensive research. So, you can go to B20 making no changes whatsoever in existing equipment. As you get higher and higher, you want to change it. And it's prudent to upgrade the other stuff, fuel filters, other stuff that touches the fuel. As you replace parts, you want to use bio-rated components.
Okay, so burner assemblies and orifices.
No, they're all the same. It's really the soft stuff the fuel touches. Metals, brass, steel, aluminum are basically impervious. It's the soft stuff. The fuel filters, the fuel lines, they make flexible fuel lines of a nitrile, the gaskets, things like that. They would need to be upgraded to bio-rated components.
Huh. When there was over from the coal into the oil side, was there a big pushback about jobs and coal being changed out, or was it more of a natural progression?
Sure. Well, a lot of the people that delivered it transitioned, so the company stayed alive. They delivered wood, and then they delivered coal, and then they delivered oil. They actually, a lot of them delivered ice as well, so they were getting killed twice. Ice was getting killed by refrigeration.
Yep.
homes, and while it's simultaneous, these both happened at the same time, 20s, 30s. The heating market was transitioning from coal to oil, and the cooling refrigeration, home refrigeration, from ice boxes where they delivered blocks of ice to, compression refrigeration.
I hadn't really thought about that too much. We did a show a while back where we were talking about the history of refrigeration, how we made that transition, because particularly in the Northeast is where we cut a lot of our ice, right? That would be cut out of lakes and streams to be transported cross country for perishables, and then we moved into our mechanical refrigeration system. And so we would have been converting. So those companies that were goods delivery of ice and coal now are struggling with the mechanical refrigeration as well as a automated fuel for the burner assemblies.
Yeah, so most of them transitioned from the coal ice people to heating oil people. Very common. A lot of 3, 4, 5 generation companies still delivering heating oil.
Okay, this is the stuff I love to learn.
Well, the ice business is really hard.
Multi-generational. A lot of them still around.
No kidding. All right, so as we start looking at this, so as educational facilities, as technicians, and we start looking at this transition, so we are going to be going through a new phase. So we went from wood to coal to fuel oil. Now we're going to be looking at new fuels going forward. Let's talk about some of the things, the tips and the perspectives that we need to be able to help when transitioning into this new generations of fuels.
Okay, we'll start with biodiesel. That's the most popular, biggest market penetration now. It's a big market. I believe the industry-wide is around B12 or B13. If you took the average, what everybody's selling, it's about 12% biofuel right now, and basically all of that is biodiesel. So biodiesel is made from the soybean, animal fats, canola oil feedstocks. It's a chemical process, low temperature, 160, 170 degrees, atmospheric pressure, not expensive equipment. Reaction, transesterification. So it's methanol and lye. There's a lot more to it, obviously. I'm simplifying this. A lot of processes. Initially, years ago, 20, 30 years ago, there was a lot of home brews. That's basically fallen by the wayside. These are large professional companies that only make ASTM spec product. It's homogeneous. The product's very high quality. There are some differences. I mentioned before, it does have an oxygen content. Heating oil, most fossil fuels are just a combination of, they call them hydrocarbons, because they're just hydrogen and carbon. Biodiesel has an oxygen segment. About 10% of it by mass is oxygen.
I didn't know
So it's
that.
an oxygen. So it actually burns a little bit cleaner because of that oxygenation. It brings its own oxygen with it to some extent. So it offsets the oxygen readings with the combustion allowance of slight. About 0.3 to 0.4% to difference between pure biodiesel and pure petroleum. Obviously, the blends are less than that.
I remember in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, when we were starting to look at fuels a little bit differently, there was a big push for, you talked about home brews, where people were, brewing their own home biodiesel, and you couldn't find a Mercedes 300 SEL anywhere on the market because everyone was yanking the drivetrain out to put into their Jeep or their off-road rig, or they were actually keeping the 300 and they were home brewing their own biofuel. So is it a similar process that we would see that they were utilizing?
It's kind of equated to the craft brewing craze, where a lot of guys did it at home, and now it's mainstream. I mean, go out and places have you 30, 40 choices of different craft brews, and it's a superior product now. I don't know anybody, not many, that would prefer a mainstream beer to a good local craft beer. And it's kind of the same thing, where it's the little tiny home guys are out of the picture. These are serious producers, serious operations. They're businessmen.
So have the standards changed for that? Have we established standards for manufacturing?
So there's a standard for biodiesel and a standard for heating oil. And so the biodiesel that's sold has to meet that ASTM spec. There's an ASTM standard for biodiesel.
Okay, absolutely. Do we want to dive then into, I know earlier we were kind of talking about using some of the presentation and talking a little bit about some of the tips for when we're working with some of these new fuels. Is there anything else we want to cover?
No, I think there's some differences from it, but I mean, there's more similarities. There's another fuel, renewable diesel. It's just really hitting the market now. It meets the ASTM spec for diesel fuel. So it is legally diesel fuel. There'd be no changes whatsoever required to use that. And we're doing some field tests on it, some blends between biodiesel, renewable diesel, but it's starting to spread out in the East Coast. It was big on the West Coast as a transportation fuel, but we're starting to see some market penetration here. So those are the two fuels we're working on.
Now, is it the same distillation process that we were talking about previously?
No, biodiesel is a chemical process. Low temperature, atmospheric pressure, you can do it in that room you're in right there, home brewers.
Right.
You need a refinery to make renewable diesel. So it's a major capital investment. It's usually petroleum refineries that are being repurposed.
Really? Okay.
I mean, as that's declining, what are you going to do with this multi-billion-dollar refinery? It's not a big deal to convert it to become a biorefinery. And there's a lot of byproducts of that also, the renewable diesel, the sustainable aviation fuel, which is also all huge growing markets.
Yeah, because we don't always think about that in our industry of, how many other industries are going through these transitions at the same time. We're talking about these fuels for our appliances, but we're also actually talking about fuels for transportation as well.
Transportation is a big market. It's kind of hard to electrify a ocean-going vessel or a railroad, right?
Yeah, very true. Yeah.
So those are the marine and rail are big competitors for that fuel, in addition to the trucking, obviously.
Can you imagine the size of the battery you'd have to have for a locomotive?
Really long extension cord.
Long, yeah. Eugene Silverstein made the comment of going from California to Florida with both of his electric vehicles. He just bought every extension cord that he could from Home Depot all the way there, and he just kept plugging them in. It'd be kind of the same thing with the train going across country. All right, so let's spend a little bit of time. Let's kind of dive into, as we're talking about like the bioheat side, and this, I'll hand this over. You'll be able to switch the presentation from your side as well. So let's talk about, as we start making these transitions, things to just understand it a little bit better and tips for working with these.
I think technicians in general are resistant to change, whether it's oil or and I'm understating this. I mean, they'll go along with anything as long as their grandfather approved of it. It's very tough. I mean, everything new gets a lot of resistance.
Yeah.
So it's basically the same thing here. There's been, some resistance from the field. It's a newer fuel. It's a new fuel, and it's a little bit different. It gets blamed for it. Now, anything that goes wrong, of course, becomes blamed on that. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of time and energy into educating technicians. A lot of my time is spent on that. As well as doing research to make sure this stuff actually works. So this is a presentation I obviously did a couple of months ago in Rhode Island.
Right.
Basically the same everywhere. It's tips for the technician, stuff you can use in the field. Much, not as much theoretical, although there is some in there, more practical applications.
Which is what we're looking for. I mean, we're technicians, we're educators, we're looking at, how do we discuss this in a classroom. I just had a conversation earlier this week with an educator that reached out to me because they have a training facility that actually has the equipment for doing fuel oil training. And he said, we hear a lot of buzz about alternative fuels in the industry, and I think we need to start refocusing our program on renewable fuels and make some of these contacts. Do you know anyone in the industry? And I was like, I do know a guy. Oh, let me get you in contact with him. Here's the guy. And so this is what we're doing, is we're here to stay educated on these transitions and to give you the resources to properly work with them and to train on them as well.
Sure. We actually have a new school. We partner with people for training. We provide it here, obviously, but to do it, we partner with community colleges, high schools, trade schools. And we just got a new school in upstate New York that did not offer the training previously, never had oil, and was not going to have oil. It's strictly going to be renewable fuel based, and that's why they're getting into it and offering to the students. They have no background in oil. There's not oil in the building, and there's not going to be. It's going to be strictly renewable, 100% biodiesel in this case.
Well, it's the change of, of our times, so we have to stay up to date. That's the reason Ty and I are out here traveling right now, is to be able to see the technologies that are changing in the industry and equip you with the resources to make sure that you have all that you need. So we encourage you to reach out to learning.noraweb.org. Get a hold of the training resources to dive a little bit deeper. We've partnered with NORA to be able to bring the training resources into their own ESCO catalog. So if you're an educator and you're looking to dive a little bit deeper into the resources that are available for you, you can scan this QR code. You can go right on over to the ESCO bookstore and look for the NORA Technician's Manual so you can dive a little bit deeper into these training resources. So we thank you very much for partnering with us on that, because this wasn't traditionally something that we taught on here. And now that we look at the transitions that are happening in the world, we know that we have to. Paul, thank you very much. This is exactly what we're talking about, because we have the question, are there schools that still teach this? Absolutely. There's one right here. And so we are still getting these calls to know where the resources are. So we're just here to help connect you with the right resources.
Want to move ahead?
Yeah, let's go ahead.
I can't change the slide.
Oh, no. All right, on the screen, do you have a couple arrows?
No.
All right, I can change them for you then.
Sure. Go ahead. This is a presentation obviously I did to basically a group of technicians in East Providence, Rhode Island a couple of months ago, and basically wanted to find why biofuel, why the industry needs to transition to it. A lot of technicians they don't like change whatsoever. Why this needs to be done? You really have to understand the necessity of it, that there's no future for high carbon fuels of any sort. And it's going to be a low carbon green future. And that's where we need to go. As much as I, like to stay where it is, that's not an option, unfortunately. We need to change, just like with the refrigerants, it's moved on, right? And now it's going to be a new world going forward from here. Same exact thing.
Absolutely.
So we find what is a biofuel, how's it different, kind of stuff we already talked about a little bit. The testing we've done on it, and what they can do in the field. There's a practical application, practical stuff that can help solve some problems. Good to go. I think we kind of talked about that. Why biodiesel? If we're not going to use biodiesel, then what's the alternative? It could be renewable diesel, but the status quo isn't an option. So as I said, it's from soybean, canola oil. UCO is used cooking oil. That's very popular. It has even a better carbon score. It would be a waste product otherwise. So the work on producing the biodiesel, all the renewable fuels aren't 100%. Their carbon scores aren't, 100. They're not perfectly clean. There's fuels that are used in the production, the growing, the fertilizing, the harvesting, the processing, on and on and on and on. UCO has the best carbon score. It's already been used in McDonald's or a Burger King or a Kentucky Fried Chicken or your local Chinese joint, and now it's being repurposed. And there's some animal fats, that's a minor percentage. It's a transesterification chemical process. And depending on the feedstock, you get anywhere from a 50 to 90% carbon reduction.
That's pretty significant.
It's big. And the even at the 50% level, the average is 70, obviously. So that's what you use because you don't know what the feedstock is most of the time.
Right.
And it meets the STM D670, 6751 spec. That's the biodiesel spec. So this isn't somebody's home brewed mix. Renewable diesel, like I said, it's the same exact feedstocks. It's treated with hydrogen called hydrotreating. Very high pressure, very high temperature. In Europe, they call it HVO, hydrogenated vegetable oil.
Yeah, I've seen that before.
The UK is going heavily. There's about 1 million oil-fired homes in the UK. Germany's pretty strong also. They're going to HVO. France has a 40% biofuel mandate for heating right now.
Wow.
France, they call it FAME, fatty acid methyl esters. It's biodiesel.
Oh,
They call it an F40 mandate in France. It's just another word for it. Same exact thing. There's no oxygen. So there's absolutely no readjustment needed when you do it.
Right.
Colloquially, people refer to it as bioheat. And bioheat is a blend, not pure biodiesel, a blend of heating oil and biodiesel at some level, anywhere from 6% to 99%. Both of the fuels need their spec.
So we'll see that term bioheat out there as a blended biofuel.
It's become popular, and it's in common use.
Sure.
People call it boiler control and aquastat, even though that's a Honeywell trademark.
Right.
My grandmother used to call it refrigerator or Frigidaire, but that was obviously Frigidaire's trademark.
Yeah, sure. All right, Ty, I got a question for you. So if the burner is properly adjusted and there is zero smoke, no soot, whatsoever in the appliance. How can it be reduced?
How can your CO be reduced?
Mm-hmm.
Well, a combustion analysis. We
Okay.
can add oxygen.
Ah.
It's carbon it's how the carbon could be reduced, not CO.
Oh, okay. I read it wrong then.
Yeah, it's carbon.
Cut. How can the carbon be reduced in these exhausts, Ty?
That's really the question.
Okay. And so what would be the answer for this one, Bob?
It's a lot of technicians, if the boiler's properly adjusted and running, it's going to be spotless.
Right.
And when people say we want a carbon reduction, they see carbon in its solid state. Right? You can't see CO2 or CO, it's a gas.
Right.
Carbon reductions, we're actually talking about a reduction in CO2 emissions. But it's even a little more trickier than that because the CO2 emissions actually don't reduce. It's the source of that CO2 that's being reduced. I don't know if that's hard to grasp.
I'm thinking about this.
Right?
All right, let's dive a little deeper.
Mirror image of oxygen in the combustion analysis.
Yes.
What goes down. So the CO2 basically stays the same if you switch from pure heating oil to 100% biodiesel. So a lot of techs will be, we spent all this time and energy learning about this. We got new fuel and we changed the things, but we only saw a 0.3 drop in CO2. What are we doing here? It's
Yeah,
just
exactly.
CO2.
Huh, okay.
And that's the trick. It's a later slide, but that's what we're doing here.
All right. I might have brought that question in a little too early. So we'll dive a little deeper that here in a minute. Okay.
Yeah, we're talking about a gas, not carbon in its physical state. So when people say carbon reduction, it's the whole world. When they say carbon reduction, we're not talking about actual, coal or carbon or physical carbon. We're talking about really means CO2.
Sure. The elemental form of carbon.
Yeah. So, but CO2 is what they're talking about. So it's obviously we're talking about the gas, CO2. There's for each gallon of heating oil, you get 22.4 pounds of CO2. Another common question is, how can you get 22 pounds of CO2 out of a fuel that only weighs 7 pounds itself?
It's a very good question.
And the answer is the mass is from the oxygen from the combustion process, right?
Right.
You need 1,500 cubic feet of air to burn a gallon of heating oil. It's petroleum we're talking about here. And the extra mass is that. So when they say tons of carbon, we reduce our output by tons of carbon. Even in a gas heated home, if you do the math and they used 1,000 therms, it doesn't weigh that much. It's pretty light. How did you cut the output by 7 tons? And it's the oxygen content from the air, from the combustion air. It's heavy.
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense. I'm glad you explained that way because I actually hadn't thought about it from that perspective, and I should have.
This kind of goes back to what I was talking about before. So the flue gas CO2 or oxygen, they're the same thing, just mirror opposites of each other, are similar. How are we reducing CO2 emissions? And the answer is on the next slide. Probably even trying to explain it. It's the carbon cycle. So petroleum, oil, fossil fuels are from fossils. So they're millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of years old, potentially.
Sure.
So they've been sequestered underground for, call it 100 billion years. And then we pump it up and process it and burn it. And that carbon is now being released to the atmosphere that's been out of circulation for 100 million years. So the Earth's a closed system, like a terrarium. There's no new carbon coming in. I mean, you get a meteor or something, yeah, but I mean, whatever was here at the Big Bang and the Earth formed, that's all the carbon we have, just where it's located. So that's been locked up for 100 million years, and now we're dumping it back out into the atmosphere. Versus on the right, short cycle, new carbon, we'll call it. Farmer in Nebraska planted soybeans a couple of months ago. He's going to harvest them in October. Those soybeans are absorbing carbon dioxide out of the air throughout their whole cycle. And then they get crushed to the oil, and then the oil gets processed to biodiesel, and somebody in Providence, Rhode Island burns it and releases that exact same amount of CO2 that those plants absorb over their lifespan, their 1 summer lifespan.
Yeah, so we're not really talking about burning more efficiently to reduce our carbon emissions. We're talking about using the carbon more responsibly.
A different fuel, although efficiency is part of it too. We want to do both.
Absolutely.
But here we're just talking about the fuel change. So this appliance, it's not going to be any more efficient or minuscule than it would be burning heating oil versus petroleum, versus biodiesel. It's the CO2 output, the effect on the carbon emissions overall. So those carbon emissions were offset by what the plants absorbed over their lifespan.
And I think as a consumer and as a technician in particular, it's very important to understand that difference, because when we start talking about our next generation of technicians, we have a couple generations of technicians coming into the industry that are very focused on making a global impact, to be able to provide a service to their community, to their world, to reduce our carbon footprint. So when we start talking about new fuels, it's very important to understand that difference between a reduction of carbon emissions and the carbon equivalency based on carbon that's already accessible, carbon that has been utilized from bioproduction. And I think it's an extremely important factor, even in the classroom, to discuss, is that if we are going to draw that old carbon out of oil, we're actually releasing that into the atmosphere versus utilizing carbon at the surface that is that's here and it's already part of our existing environmental system.
Absolutely. It's a great recruiting tool, I think, for the industry. The severe HVAC, that was probably, there's a severe shortage, obviously, of HVAC techs.
Yeah.
Like, active for young people, they want to be in a green industry. Like you said, they want to help, save the world.
Absolutely, they do.
This one's really, really technical. I don't know if you want to get into this.
Okay, that's up to you.
It's up to you. There's been some incidences of fuel pumps binding. People blame it on the biodiesel. It's not really that. The main focus with this, and the point that probably is the most applicable universally, is that you can't fix the problem and think you diagnosed the problem. Sometimes you just address the symptom without ever getting to the underlying problem. And that's really, this is specific to the oil industry. So a pump would bind, and people put a new pump in. Pumps don't normally bind. That's not a normal failure mode for a pump. If a pump is binding, there's an underlying cause in almost everything. If a contactor fails, a lot of times there's other reasons for that. And if you don't address that, you're going to be putting another contactor in shortly. So this is kind of the oil version of that. If you don't address that underlying problem, you're going to be back tomorrow, the next day, or next week and do the same thing over and over again. So it's oil specific, but the point, and it really is universal, is you have to address the cause and not just fix the symptom.
It's like a compressor going bad, Ty, and I put a new compressor in thinking it was just a compressor.
It's never just a compressor.
It's never just a compressor.
Something caused it.
Yeah, it's the same thing with everybody. It's universal in the HVAC industry, and this is the version of that. Unless you find the underlying cause and correct it, you're going to be back again. It's amazing how many people do this over and over and over.
It's a very interesting topic. Ty and I actually just got on the conversation today on our way back from lunch talking about LP and talking about the amount of moisture that is that can potentially be introduced into an LP tank from its original manufacturing facility through different layers of distribution and the effects that moisture has in a fuel. So really what we're talking about is moisture contamination within the system. How do you see moisture contamination looking the same or looking different in our new fuels versus a traditional hydrocarbon fuel?
It's slightly more, there's fuel tanks outside. About 10% of the heating oil tanks in the country are outside of the structure, exposed to the weather.
Yeah.
Historically, they've been problems with water. Hot during the day, sun sits on it. Quite commonly, they're painted black. It's like a solar collector. Temperature drops at night, and you get condensation. Unlike a propane tank, a heating oil tank's open to the atmosphere, so we can breathe. So it's a problem. It's outside tanks primarily. Tanks inside or buried are not an issue. Temperature's basically stable, but outdoor above ground tanks are an issue, and we're working on a lot of solutions for that. That's a major effort towards resolving that issue. But they do build up water similar to, and they're delivered, like you said, with propane tanks. They're that when you get them. The water has to be physically drained out before you install it and fill it with fuel.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about.
Exact thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about some of the signs of moisture within a fuel oil system, the obvious ones.
This is a fuel pump that's been pulled apart. The one on the right, the one on the left is your garden variety corrosion. You can, if you look close, you can kind of see it. That's obviously water. So you just get a pump that's bound. It could be bad in other ways, but if it's bound, that's the failure mode that's going to indicate this. You want to open it up and take a look and see what I'm dealing with. Is it water Is it a sticky residue? Exactly what I'm dealing with. And the one on the left is garden variety corrosion, and the one on the right is sticky stuff. Degraded fuels, polymers from degraded fuel, usually exacerbated by water. But you can see the difference if you look at it. It's pretty obvious. So before a tech would change the pump, you want to take a look and see what you're dealing with. What's the underlying cause? How do I stop this from happening again?
A lot easier than cutting the top of a compressor off to see what happened to it, isn't it?
Absolutely.
It is. But it's back to the same thing with whether you're troubleshooting anything. So obviously a lot of people think it's high biodiesel blends. We take these pumps in, pull them apart, test them, and they all basically have varnish on them. And it happens with all different blends of biodiesel. B0 is none, that's pure petroleum. So it's degraded fuel. The fuel sits in outdoor tanks primarily. Somebody in the chat posted about two-pipe systems. A two-pipe system circulates the fuel about 18 gallons an hour, burns what it needs, typically under a gallon per hour, and the other 17 plus goes back into the tank. So the fuel gets warmed and then dumped back out into a cold tank continually.
Oh, wow.
And you get huge amount of moisture and condensation. Somebody just posted that at the top of the chat. And he's in Alaska. And I'm sure it's quite bad there, but I mean, it's a problem in New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island too.
Sure.
So I recommend against using a two-pipe system for a lot of different reasons, that just being one of them. But this situation, basically 95% is correlated with outside tanks and two-pipe installation.
So do you see more of a need for water filtering and water separation on our fuel systems?
It's really tough on residential heating oil systems to do that. Really what you do is you stick the tank full of water on an annual basis. You want to make sure it's properly installed. Fuel tanks should be pitched towards the outlet. So if there is any water, right, is going to be at the bottom. The oil's going to float on top. That it can flow out into the filter. If it's minor amounts, it can go through the system and be burned, evaporated. If it's major, it generally sticks in the filter, and the tech it should be serviced once a year like anything. You can see it. So when we get a lot of the fuel complaints, these are very site specific. So somebody will call and say, we have this customer, we changed 6 pumps, 8 pumps, the record's 14. So immediately ask them, how about sites contaminated fuel? How about sites got this delivery the same day, before or after they have any issues? And the answer has been 100% no. So it's site specific. It's a fuel problem, but it's really a tank problem. If it were fuel, delivery truck makes around 30 deliveries a day plus. Urban areas, they can do more, rural maybe slightly less, but it's average 30.
Okay.
They'll have one customer that has this issue. So the other 29 people delivered that day didn't have the issue, which kind of makes you think, it wasn't an issue from the truck, that they got bad fuel. So it's fuel borne, obviously, to get into the fuel pump, but it's really a tank problem.
Okay, very good information.
So it's most commonly water. You can stick fuel tanks, same way they do in a gas station. That green stuff is a paste that you put on a stick, lower it into the tank. If there's water, it turns pink.
Huh.
And you can tell the level. They do it in gas stations routinely, on a daily basis. Yeah. So you really want to check it and remove it. ULSD is ultra low sulfur diesel. So I call it heating oil, and everybody says heating oil, but it's really ULSD. New York State eliminated sulfur from heating oil in 2012. So we use ULSD, ultra low sulfur heating oil, 15 ppm sulfur. Acid rain, sulfur dioxide. So it was a byproduct. So there's no sulfur in the fuel. Hydroscopic, which means it can absorb moisture directly out of the air, slightly more. Both ULSD and biodiesel are slightly more hydroscopic than petroleum. So it's more crucial that you check tanks full of water, that they be properly pitched and that type of thing.
It's like going from mineral to POE. It sounds awfully familiar to us.
There's a lot of similarities.
Yes, there is.
Yeah, so we've also done a lot of research on eliminating two-pipe systems. It makes good sense, and dual filtration. If you do have issues with contaminated fuel or the tank conditions not good, or some degraded fuel, those are 2 filters, an older style off to the left there and a newer, more modern spin-on type to the right. It doesn't have to be that. It could be any 2 that you want, but it filters in depth.
Okay, absolutely.
This is going to get really technical about oil burners here now. Biodiesel has a slightly higher boiling point. It evaporates at a slightly higher temperature than heating oil. Those are 2 different heads. And the light brownish stuff, it's more visible on the one on the right. You can kind of see that it looks sticky. It's
Yeah.
not, yeah. And it's basically unburned fuel that's being pulled back on the head. It only happens at very high blends of biodiesel, 50 and up, 40 and up, that you get it. And what's happening is the fuel's a little bit harder to evaporate, and small quantities obviously are being pulled back onto the head and sitting there and not being burned, developing this sticky head
Build
coat.
Sure.
So
Absolutely.
we're doing a huge amount of field tests right now to get into this. We do a lot of lab tests, kind of narrowing down the possible solutions in the lab. A good one, obviously field tests take forever. They're a year or 2 years long. So a very rapid test. It happens during the starts and stops more so than during the run cycle. So we'll cycle it on and off 4,000 times, see if make a change, see if it helps, and then implement that in a field site, and then follow that up for a couple of years to see whether it's worked or not. So far, there's been a lot of good stuff. There's no magic bullet yet. It might be an all of the above solution at the end. It doesn't happen everywhere. It's spotty, but it needs to be solved. So a huge amount of effort is going to this. A lot of field testing.
One of the questions that just came in from Paul, I think it's more of a comment, but somewhat of a question that could be addressed, is when he's working with residential, they did have a problem with algae in fuel oil. Is that something that you encounter much still?
No, not as much as previously, but yes, biologicals can grow in diesel fuel. They actually feed on it. You need water in it for that to happen. They need both. They need the water, and they live at the water fuel interface. If you pump the water out, it solves the problem, but they do make biocides to deal with that. You don't want to use it when it's not needed. It kind of gives them immunity. Stragglers in there, and they're used to getting this biocide, like an antibiotic where 20 people take it.
Absolutely.
Immunity. So if the tank has it, you want to make sure that it has it, and then you want to hit it with a killer dose. And that solves it. But unfortunately, the residue, will clog filters until they're gone.
Wow.
Yep.
That's interesting.
I'm that old too. I started in 1978.
Yeah, well, these are things we want to talk about. Remember, this is about the history of fuels and things that we have encountered and things that we may encounter in the future, and understanding what has happened in this world so that we're prepared for this really next generation of fuels.
Yeah, no, Paul's right. I was there in the 70s and it was common. So as I said, it's not every site appliance. There's different, it's worse in some than others. Some of the solutions are to increase the fuel pressure, atomization. The fuel droplets are tinier with higher pressure. So the standard historically has been 100. Most manufacturers move to 150, 140, 150, 160. You can go up higher than that, 180, 190, even 200 if need be. You have to decrease the nozzle size, the orifice, right? If you increase the pressure, you're going to increase the flow rate. You got to drop the orifice to keep the input the same.
Yeah, to maintain BTU capacity.
That helps a lot. Fan off delay, colloquially we call it post purge, even though that's the UL term. We're not supposed to use it anymore. It's keeping the fan on after the burner stops. So the fuel, the solenoid is an electric valve that controls the fuel flow, similar to a little gas valve. It shuts, but you keep the blower going after to purge any combustion byproducts and cool the head off for a few seconds, typically 15 to 30 seconds.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, very intriguing.
Yep. It's going to get really super technical too.
Oh yeah, that's okay. We're here for super technical. I mean, there's still a lot of people hanging on here, so they're obviously interested in where we're going with this. And
done a lot of research, obviously. The issue, one of the perceived issues originally was biodiesel contains oxygen.
right.
So some uses pure biodiesel, and they adjust the burner with the combustion analyzer to run properly on pure biodiesel. And now they run out of fuel, they run out of biodiesel, the house is sold, and now somebody comes in with pure petroleum. And now there's no oxygen. That's the fear. Now we're going to
analysis, yeah.
Right, that's the other way. You're going to get an efficiency drop, and it's not great, but you probably won't even know. The consumer won't know. The other way, yeah, it could be a problem. It was a major concern, so we put a lot of time and effort. This was years ago, 5, 6 years ago, 4 years ago, into seeing exactly what happens both in the lab and field sites, that you don't get these issues, that you can use any fuel. UL now lists burners at B100. So 2 of the 3 manufacturers, all their production is B100 right now, has been for almost 2 years at this point. So B100 approved burners, if you go and buy a new one, that's all you're going to get. And basically the difference, other than the fuel pump that's rated to handle the biofuel, is it needs to pass that test. The burner needs to be set up to manufacturer spec on a bio, and then switch to heating oil, and no smoke, no CO2, still stay within manufacturer specification.
I think that's very important to discuss. So like the one educator who had a fuel oil training facility that hasn't been used in a few years, and now they want to start reintroducing fuel oil education because of the introduction of new fuels. If they're going to replace a burner on an assembly and they get a new burner and it's a B100 and they go, wait a minute, is this going to work in my application? I think that is the important part of discussing, what is different about these.
They're fully, either direction. So a B100 burner can use any fuel, B0 to B100.
Okay, very, very, very good point to
Backward compatible.
bring up.
So I'm saying they updated this standard about a little less than a year ago. 2 years ago, it was November 22, actually, almost 2 years ago. And the test is the fuel set up with B100 manufacturer specs. Can't touch anything, just switch the fuel to pure petroleum, and it still needs to operate cleanly and safely after this fuel change.
Easy peasy. That's what we like.
Yeah, that's what anybody expects. This is our lab here in Plainview.
Nice.
Typical middle of the road oil system.
Mm-hmm.
We had a Carlin Easy One burner on it. We adjusted it B100 11.3. You switched the fuels clean, not touching anything. And you got a 0.6 drop in CO2, which is to be expected. The oxygen content was removed. So we took an oxygenated fuel at 11.3 and went to a non-oxygenated fuel, and we got the rise that we would expect. CO2 and O2 are mirrors of each other. For some reason, the gas guys use O2 and the oil guys use CO2, but they're functionally the same.
Equivalent. It is interesting because I do hear those cross terms quite a bit.
Yeah, no, I don't know why. And the problem is, wherever you start, you stay there. You learn in CO2.
Right.
I think I can talk in oxygen, but I think in CO2. I can speak it, but not like a native speaker.
Okay.
I don't know why that is, but it is.
Sure.
I did it with a couple different burners. We did it with Beckett. Beckett's the largest manufacturer in the country. Same appliance, same oil. Just switch the burner out. 12.1 and 12.3 going to B0. This is going the other direction.
Okay.
B100 to B0, same thing.
Absolutely. So really what we're doing is we're showing the differences as we're going from our traditional B0s up through B100.
Yeah, but I mean, we did this well prior to UL. It was kind of to assuage the people who had the questions in the field, but now that UL's kind of done it, it kind of, they're a third party, everybody recognizes their opinion.
Yep, absolutely.
We did this kind of prove to the thing to do it. There's another one, you have to be combustion testing. There's still people using wet kits in this industry. Not a good idea in 2024.
Sure.
We set it up properly. We get a lot of complaints, that we're having this issue or that issue, and you'll ask them what the O2 is, what's your CO, what's your draft, and they can't answer that question, or they do, and the numbers are not right. So it's really not the fuel. You aren't set up right to begin with. You happen to, be there at the time. So this printout is basically an illustration of where you should be: 5% O2, 0 CO. A good running oil burner should be under 10 ppm. It's running properly in a typical residential appliance.
Excellent.
You have to account for cold air. This is a big thing, obviously. And in the class, you'll ask people how much O2, and they'll say it's less. There's less oxygen in cold air. In fact, there's not. If you bring a combustion analyzer up to the top of Mount Everest, it would read 20.9%. It's the density that changes, right? It's not compressed and packed in. It's really diffuse as the air gets colder. So you want to be conscious of that, because now when you stack the two of those together, you're up in Maine and you have an oil burner and somebody sets it up on B100 in August, or yesterday, it was in the 90s up there then, and they can get -10 in the winter, and you have an outside air intake, sealed combustion system.
So one of the questions that just came in when we're talking about O2 is, what percent of excess O2 are we shooting for with some of our biofuels?
The same, typically 25 to 35%. But if you want a hard number, I'd say 30. It's really, there's a lot of technician, latitude there. If you feel there may be an insufficient combustion air issue, or you might have a cold air issue in the winter, you might want to be a little, or you can use the chart that tells you. But yeah, even then, they give you a range. It's not set, but you can see the impact of different temperatures, what it's going to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you don't want to stack them up. You don't want to, individually, the bio and the cold air are probably fine individually, but what happens when you get them? So that's why cold air is something to be really conscious of if you're going to use fuels that may have a little impact on the O2 content.
Sure, I get that.
In concert, and can answer his question right there. This is a really interesting chart. It gives you all the O2, CO2, and excess air readings at different blend levels. B0, which is petroleum, B20, B50, and B100. And you can see there's not a lot of difference.
Wow. Yeah. Very similar.
Obviously, the oxygen stays the same. Combustion analyzers read oxygen. There's an O2 sensor. And then when you put a fuel into it, butane, propane, heating oil, it's a mathematical calculation to calculate the CO2. So none of them are actually calculating CO2. They're calculating, you're reading O2 and CO and then calculating the CO air free and all those other numbers.
Yep, absolutely.
So a lot of techs get wrapped up in, the CO2 is not right because of the fuel, and we'll just use oxygen. Oxygen, if you didn't change the fuel in the analyzer, you could just use the O2 reading on anything. And you're going to be correct because it's reading O2.
Okay, absolutely.
Actually, I'm ahead of the slide.
That's right.
Yeah, so it's not fuel dependent. You can use it on any fuel. All the other numbers, the efficiency number is going to be wrong. Your CO2 numbers are going to be wrong. But the as read oxygen and CO are going to be right, no matter what. They're right. Sensors are good; those numbers are correct. The AHR spec for combustion analyzers accuracy is plus or minus 0.3, which is coincidentally just about the difference between heating oil and biodiesel.
All right.
Wow.
Within the range of accuracy of a handheld combustion, not a lab grade. A handheld combustion.
Yeah, a typical,
background
contractor grade.
Yeah, so a lot of people don't understand. A lot of techs have problems with all those other numbers. They'll focus on either the CO2 or the CO, and they don't really understand the other one. And this is just really an explanation of excess air. It's combustion air surplus to stoichiometric requirement, and it's the safety margin, right? If perfect world, we could have perfect combustion. Well, we need that safety margin because of what happens, and it's 30% plus or minus. There's some technician discretion there on your.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, as we continue going deeper into this, we could have probably an entire conversation just on those.
We have a whole day class on this, so we can spend a lot of time on it. We can really get into the weeds.
Yes. So, Bob, let's talk a little bit about the training resources from NORA. We have a lot of educators that are re-looking at their programs, knowing that we're going to be updating our labs, we're going to be teaching on new technologies and innovations. What are some resources that we have other than the actual technician's manual for getting more comfortable with these new generation of fuels?
Sure. At the learning.NORA website, there's videos. So NORA runs a certification program as well. We have 3 different levels: bronze, silver, and gold. Bronze entry, mid, more advanced. And to renew these, there's not another test. There's a test initially at the bronze level. There's no tests on the other ones. It's all CEU based. So to maintain a license, it's a license in the state of New Hampshire. In Vermont, you need it. It's required. Also a couple counties in New York State. So they have to maintain this certification. It's all CEU based. The idea being, what's the point of taking the same test over and over again? You want people to, learn what's new. So we try to keep it constantly updated on newer stuff. There's stuff on biofuels there, but anybody can watch them. It's not, it's not that you need the CEUs. We have a technical resource center. We started developing some shorter task-oriented videos where we found that techs really aren't as interested in, those. Some of the manufacturers start at the beginning of time, and the guy just wants to know, how do I program this control? I'm having this problem. How do I fix it? So we're focusing more on those little short 30-second
Nice.
Because a lot of electronics coming into this end of the industry that haven't been here before.
Oh, yeah.
Programs for different applications. How do I program this control on this boiler? How do I do this with it? Very short task oriented. They're all in the technical resource center, which is also there. We have the book in audio version at no charge there. You can download it. It's available in PDF version there too, only by chapter, not the entire book. Again, you can download that. We have podcasts, all kinds of stuff on there. It's all on the learning.noraweb.org. But
All
that's
right.
a big, obviously, NORA's education.
Absolutely. Tell you what, we're going to hop over and Ty, I think we're going to play a couple-minute video, just kind of an overview of where we are today. Give everyone in the audience an opportunity to think about some questions and chats. If you have anything you'd like to connect with Bob and Nora, put that in the chat for us. And we'll see you in about 2 minutes. And I think we're going to have to make us a road trip up to Bob's training facility, Ty.
Sounds good to me.
Love to have you.
I am liking this idea. So we'll be back here in just a couple minutes. Like I said, grab some questions, grab some comments, and we'll see you in 2. All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining us on the ESCO Roadshow. So we have the wonderful opportunity to come down to the Lennox Technical Training Facility here in Richardson, Texas. And I'm telling you what, Ty, this is pretty cool. What do you think?
It is absolutely awesome. There's so much stuff that I want to go play with and take apart right now, having to contain myself.
And this is just the showroom. Like, this is just the entrance into all of it. So we start out here, and every direction you go is a different training opportunity. So let's talk about some of the training opportunities that we've seen today while we were here visiting this amazing facility.
What's really awesome about here is we see that they have even from brazing. They got brazing
hands-on.
tables all the way up to the high-end technology, the whole entire range of
VRV stuff, VRF stuff.
VRF, yes. Oh, it's just really awesome. And they have things that are opened up where you can see it. They got boards where they can actually get the hands on and practice things, and they have levels from 1 all the way through the high levels to equipment where they got systems that they can put switches in there to diagnose these problems. Absolutely awesome.
I'm loving it. So we're going to go explore the Build-A-Tech program, and we're going to take you on an adventure. And so let's go take a look at the Lennox Build-A-Tech program. All right, that was a lot of fun, and we're glad everyone stayed in and joined us through the day. We highly encourage you to reach out to Bob and the team at NORA at learning.noraweb.org to get a little deeper educated into the future of our industry now that we've had a chance to look at the history of our fuel industry. And I don't see any other questions or comments in the chat, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up for the day. Ty, any other questions or comments, concerns that you'd like to grab while we're here?
Well, I think I'm just going to have to get that book they're talking about and learn more about this.
I absolutely agree. I'll put that link out one more time so that the QR is in the chat for everyone. Bob, any final words we would like to say to the audience before we get out of here?
Oh, thanks for coming. It's been a pleasure. Had a great time.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. We're so glad to have you here. We encourage everyone to check out the Eastern Energy Expo, where you can learn about all the things that are happening in this realm of our HVACR industry. And I look forward to seeing you all again next week on Did You Know, the ESCO HVAC Show. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.